very nice to have as our lecturer today on this faculty series Bob Swartz, who's new to our faculty this year. Bob graduated in 1970 from the University of Wisconsin with a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture. He received a Master of Landscape Architecture degree in 1978. In between, he did some teaching at Wisconsin. He worked 3 years with the Illinois Department of Highways. He has worked for and been very interested in the Nature Conservancy. And the title of his lecture today, Dealing with Native Plant Communities, has always been a major interest of his since the time when he grew up as a boy on a small nursery. So it's very nice to have you talking about that topic today. Bob Swartz. Concrete nature, do we get it from the farmers, or do they?
Well, I think it's.
Have they had the idea just like everybody else?
Well, they're in a position where they sort of have to. It's their living. But I think that all of us, as a culture, I think that that's almost in our genes, so to speak, that our parents have had this concept of nature to be conquered. Their parents had that concept. And I think the whole society revolves around that concept of nature is something to be preserved, and make calendars showing pretty pictures of it and so forth, but that it has its place and it doesn't belong integrated into many more aspects of our society, our residential landscapes. And beyond residential. There are lots of other places where I think it could be applied. A lot of commercial areas where you see acres of mowed grass that really serves no function. Parks is a particular one that I think in the future is going to be, with the cost of government, the cost of maintaining mowed open spaces. Landscape for that place. All I was trying to, the point of that slide was to show that we do have this influence, this very formal.
Well, you have 4 or 5 more slides which are not in order.
Well, that makes it challenging. This is the symmetry slide, showing how there's this commitment to symmetry. If these things die, they have to be replaced, otherwise you know that something is wrong. A landscape that didn't have, even if we're not talking about using native plants and all the things that I'm interested in, even if you're just using exotic plants, I think this sort of a commitment to symmetry is kind of a problem because of things like this. If any time in the next 20 years one of these, I guess, dies, it's very likely that you'll be able to detect it and know that something is wrong with this landscape. Let's see, am I not hooked up to that projector now?
No. You're going to switch
I wouldn't feel at home if everything worked right anyway. I no, I think he's still working on it.
So go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, it's a very urbanized situation. We have a shopping center with lots of stores and lots of people, and even with the amount of walkways that he does have, I have seen children walking to the tulips. So I think it's important to provide. I don't know what kind of volumes he may have calculated that they would deal with. I don't know that it is necessarily an appropriate landscape, and it wasn't used for that purpose to say that it wasn't appropriate. I think it just showed the sort of transplantation of French and English ideas. Why not? Okay, who's on this slide now? What is it showing?
We may have lost one or two slides. One of them was crushed by the machine.
As long as nobody got hurt.
These machines have very low recoil, so that they have big springs in them. Keep them safe.
Okay. Meanwhile, back at the podium. Okay, then what this, if you can recall, what all this was leading to was the fact that, or the opinion that, I guess, that all of this traditional landscape requires a lot of energy. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it requires a lot of mowing and weeding and watering. Here you can see pruning, very delicately being executed. And like I say, I'll talk about the energy commitment a little bit more. I think there are other things besides the energy that make it undesirable. Okay, should I just continue? Okay, bingo. I think that there's a certain amount of limited interest in the traditional landscape also. Oh, this is backwards. This shows, I intended it to be a slide that shows this in the summertime, where this is a big red W on a field of white or something.
Well, that's in there.
Okay, it's maybe reversed. This is what it looks like in the winter. Again, it's not functioning as the landscape that it's intended to be. Now this is... Okay, well, okay, then, well, this is the next point that I want to make, so even if we come back to the thing, we'll have to just ignore that. Another component of this traditional landscape that we've actually gone past two, or whatever, it eventually will grow up and be too large, which becomes, again, a function or a problem that it's not. Now we're going way out. Okay, now, I would object to this as a landscape as it's working, but at least it's functioning as the landscape that it wants to be. In the other slide, which I don't know if it's the next slide or not, it is just as the roses wrapped up, we're not a functioning landscape. This in the wintertime, it's not functioning. You look at it and you know that it's not functioning. Okay, then the other slide, and I don't know how we're going to...
4 or 5 of them went out of order when we came out. All the rest will be back.
Okay, well, I can make the next point. There was another slide. This shows that eventually there's going to be, if you folks, grow up is not the landscape that it's intended to be, and what eventually happens then is that they have to be pulled out and replaced and start all over again. In this case, rather than taking everything out, they thought, well, we can get away with these, and we'll take these out. Some of that can be all right. And if I were to redo this landscape, I wouldn't take out that tree. But somehow this is kind of easily dwarfed that. So that's what you're headed towards with that sort of a commitment, landscape commitment. Okay, so they need to be replaced. Now we're jumping up a little bit here. Okay, what is the alternative then? Okay, the alternative is natural landscaping. And what is natural landscaping? Okay, a difference basically, I could define this and we could discuss what is natural for a long time, but I just want to sort of define the process as I see it. Natural landscaping is where you start a process, you make the initial commitment of plants and so forth, you do a design, it is a design landscape. But then you, rather than trying to frustrate nature by pruning and so forth, you act as a cooperator with nature. And you in a sense, let the landscape evolve as it wants to. And again, we're designers, or should be, and you can design this landscape too. I mean, if this is a restored prairie, and if I had designed this and if I hadn't put these flowers in there, you know, I could have done that. If I didn't like Gay Feather, I could have done that. And so you can design this, but it doesn't look like a strongly designed, or not a strongly designed, an intensively designed landscape. Okay, so you act as a cooperator. The landscape evolves. There's a good quote. It comes from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is to travel is better than to arrive. And that's sort of my philosophy towards landscaping. You can always enrich this. If you get this far and you think, well, I want a little more, you could add things. And the landscape could evolve. This could be something pop in by itself. But you don't have to then frustrate it and necessarily weed things out. Things that you don't want in there should weed themselves out. Things like true weeds, you know, ragweed, things like that, require disturbed environments, and this eventually will not be a disturbed environment. Okay. And this, again, should become better every year as the weeds come out and as the natural patterns start to appear and the plants propagate themselves. Another beneficial aspect of natural landscaping is the fact that you start the process. You may plant one tree, and it's very often, by this philosophy, that one tree is a tree that will reproduce itself naturally. So you're affecting 3 plants instead of planting 10 Japanese yew, and then 25 years later you still have 10 Japanese yew. You may plant 1 quaking aspen and have a nice big clone, you know, in 5 or 10 years. So it's a free lunch to a certain degree. Okay, there are different kinds of natural landscapes. This is, well, first of all, you could maybe say that there are 2 categories of natural landscapes: native communities and exotic natural landscapes, again, because basically talking about arrangement and composition and so forth. Okay, of the native communities, prairie be one kind of a natural landscape. Indiana did have prairie. About 13% of the state was prairie. Prairie is not just a grassy field. There are certain species associated. There may be a grassy field that is totally composed of exotic plants. Very often that's the way it is. This is a native prairie. It's not a restored prairie, but you could have a restored prairie that looks that good after a period of time. So it's not just any grassy field. And there are different moisture gradients of prairies, from very wet situations where really it's just a matter of definition as to whether it's a prairie or another community, and very dry situations. In Indiana, the dry situations basically are dunes. Okay, let's see. Okay, then another kind of natural landscape is the woodland. There's several different kinds of woodlands in Indiana. Probably something like 80% of the state was woodlands before settlement. There's different communities. The Maple Beach Forest was the most common woodland plant community in Indiana. Originally, it was about 50% of the state was Maple Beach. Also, there's oak forest in Indiana. In fact, Delaware County was sort of an island of oak forest within the Maple Beach community. And there are lowland forests of different kinds, some along rivers and some along lake beds. And another, by the way, I'm not identifying these flowers for time reasons. If anybody ever wants to know what it is that is holler out and I'll identify them. I know how. And okay, so then the final woodland type community is the Western Mesophytic, which is a very southern woodland community, not too widely distributed in Indiana. It has its origins in the Allegheny Mountains. Okay, there are other native communities that might, as a designer, again, you might have application for a situation like this. This is a dune situation, Indiana Dunes, National Seashore now, I guess. And that was native in the northeastern corner of Indiana. There's some more dune-type plants, birch and white pine, junipers. And then one minor community that probably wouldn't have too much reason or call to design a landscape like this is the bogs, which there are bogs in northeastern Indiana also, or probably northern Indiana in general. These are relic northern communities left from when the glaciers were in the south. Okay, so those were the native type communities. Then I mentioned non-native communities. You could say that this is a non-native natural landscape. This is an old pasture, probably, it's like pasture, cow trails. And it's dominated by probably bluegrass, which is an exotic plant. And despite the Kentucky name. And it is exotic, but again, I would call this a natural landscape. It's not really designed. There are native shrubs and trees invading, sumac and maybe some hawthorn or something, some birch coming in. But so that is a natural landscape. That is a very simple landscape to do. You in effect just let it happen. You don't even have to plant unless you want to. Okay, so that is the. And also I should mention succession is very important in all of these landscapes, particularly important here because you can see that this landscape is going to change over time. The sumac are going to grow up. Maybe some asphalt. There's aspen over there. It's going to change into a woodland unless you do something to prevent that, which you can do with sort of minimal amount of effort, burning and so forth. Okay, so that is what it is, what natural landscape is, some of the possible sorts of communities you could strive for. Okay, why natural landscaping? What are the advantages? I think I've already sort of alluded to some, but I want to go over them a little bit in a little bit more detail. I've made two large categories of reasons why, and so they're kind of very gross categories. And the first one is sort of a combination of two things. I call it ecological/economic reasons. I think that those two can be combined very well because very often an ecological solution is also an economic solution to some of these problems that we have, landscape problems, and so I combine them as being one. Okay, in the way of ecological, economic reasons, labor is one good reason I sort of alluded to before. In Milwaukee County, they reduced their mowing 10% in 1973 and started saving $170,000 annually just in mowing. There's a lot of other maintenance activities that go along with traditional landscapes. Here you can see weeding. The slide before was weeding also, but here's what you get if you can't make the input of energy, labor energy, into the traditional landscape. It's almost inevitable that's going to happen unless you really have the bucks to put into maintenance. And this, I'm showing slides of sort of municipal sorts of problems like that, but the same is true for the homeowner too. That I don't know how many people, I'm sure there are people who enjoy mowing lawn, but most of what you hear is people don't like to mow lawn. They dread it. They would rather be playing golf. There's millions of cartoons playing off of that theme. So I don't think that most people like to put the labor into the landscape that the typical landscape does require. Okay, again, close at home. Tremendous, at least from my perspective, a tremendous amount of energy and bucks and everything goes into cleaning up those leaves in the quad. And they had to do it at least twice, I believe. They have a big truck, and they have a little truck, and they have a raker by hand, and a guy with a raker by machine, and all sorts of things that
get those nasty leaves off of the quad. Okay, then another economic sort of a reason is energy. All of this lawn that we've seen requires mowing. And so we have each one of these houses, like if you go into the next slide, I believe, these are fairly dense houses, so they don't have a super big yard, but every one of those houses has a small internal combustion engine machine that is started once or twice a week during all summer, and uses up, if you multiply that by all of the suburbs that there are, for all of the cities and so forth, tremendous amount of gasoline going up in smoke. And I think we're becoming more and more aware of the problems with consumption of a scarce resource for purposes like this. Okay, another thing is fertilizer. 15% of all the fertilizer in the United States goes for ornamental purposes. That's something like 3 million tons. And in some more urbanized areas, like in Connecticut, 40% of the fertilizer used goes for non-agricultural uses. The cost on fertilizer varies depending on how rich it is and so forth. Varies from like 10 cents a pound to 50 cents a pound. I think 40 cents is about an average, so there's a tremendous amount of money that goes into fertilizer. Ortho here recommends between 20 and 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet for, well, that span covers different kind of unimproved and improved grasses. But that's a tremendous amount of fertilizer, and the United States is starting to get a certain amount of criticism for expending fertilizer for purposes like this. For example, I have read that the amount of fertilizer we use for these ornamental purposes could add 2 to 3 million tons of wheat to India's wheat crop, which, if you translate our green lawns versus starving people, it gets a little bit hard to justify. Sort of related to this then is pesticides also. Up to 40% of the pesticides applied in the United States are used in cities and suburbs. And again, it has implication beyond the immediate use. A lot of times these pesticides are persistent, even if they aren't. There's a lot of desirable life forms that are killed by pesticides, and the natural landscape does not require that. A lot of pests, there may be some pests from the natural landscape that could get into your garden, but typically pests are in effect produced by the landscape that tries to exclude them. For example, rats. If we did not have cities and houses and so forth, we wouldn't have rats. Rats don't like natural environments and natural landscapes. They are a man-produced or a man-propagated, in fact, organism. Same is true with a lot of tomato worms. If we didn't have tomatoes, there wouldn't be tomato worms, so you don't have to worry about tomato worms being bred in a non-agricultural sort of a landscape. Okay, then another sort of an ecological reason is water. The drought in California really brought that home. They couldn't even use water for unlimited personal sorts of uses, let alone use it for green grass outside the house. There's another related question as far as the effect that mining water from the land has. I've heard of a couple cities, I think Houston is one, that's supposed to be sinking a certain 11 feet or something since it was started because of the fact that water is being mined out and the land gradually settles. I know in the suburbs of Chicago they have a continuing problem because the cone of withdrawal of water from all of the suburbs, they keep drilling deeper wells, and then that draws it down further, and then they drill another well, and that then drains off of somebody else's cone of withdrawal and so forth. So there's lots of problems with water, and I don't think that we've really experienced a fraction of the problems that we'll have with unlimited water use in the future. Okay, another question is related to soil benefits. An unmowed landscape, again, not necessarily prairie, but prairie, this is an example of prairie showing how deep the roots go. An unmowed landscape provides more humus. Humus is good for worms because they eat it and help decompose it. Worms and humus are good for soil porosity, so that when you have a rainfall, instead of running right off into the drainage basins and so forth, and eventually into streams, the water soaks in, which even then might mean a greener lawn, if you want to call it a lawn. And then that also then the reduction of runoff reduces erosion and nutrient loss, and it's related to eutrophication of streams and so forth. It's very desirable if you can get the water to sink into the soil in these large vegetated areas. Okay, another issue which most people can't get too excited about, I present it just because it's a current concern of mine, has to do with maintenance of diversity. In the case I'm talking about is preservation of gene pools. Originally, this is in Illinois, originally this whole area was prairie, and there was a cross flow of genetic material from populations to populations. It was a continuous sort of thing. Now we've gone in, and this railroad track is cut through 100 or so years ago, and there's still a prairie remaining along the railroad tracks. But this prairie becomes, in a sense, a world unto itself, and you get speciation occurring, so that a big blue stem that occurs here will tend to inbreed for as long as it's here, and could become very different from big blue stem elsewhere. Like I say, that's not the kind of a thing that most people can get too excited about. I think that there are some scientific reasons why everybody should be concerned about that. I think that we would like to have pre-existing genetic combinations preserved. In some cases, one population may have some gene that contributes to stability, insects, blight resistance or something. So it's desirable to have continuous sorts of natural environments that that gene pool can go on. Also, when you're isolated like that, little islands of the native communities, they become very susceptible to destruction in this case. And if there's one particular species in this stand that is unique, it's gone. So it's desirable to try to have much broader, wider ranging plant communities. Another related, an item related to soil has to do with the number of organisms that are around. If you have more plants, you tend to have more animals. What we tend to do in the traditional landscape is we remove what this whole thing is basically showing the decomposer half of the world. We look at growing corn and so forth. The corn produces. There's another whole end of the world where you have small microfauna animals, and bigger than microfauna, earthworms and so forth, centipedes, all these things that chew the plant material back up and make those nutrients available for new plants. We remove that whole half of the world, and there no doubt are animals that eat centipedes and animals that eat wood roaches and so forth that we could maybe have if we had centipedes and wood roaches. So I think that it's sort of the idea of having a very broad base. You're probably all familiar with the idea of the trophic pyramid. You have a lot of small organisms, and one larger organism eats all of those, and then there's another organism that eats those, until you finally get up to the top of the pyramid, which characteristically is either man or a mountain lion or something like that. And you have very few animals at the top of the pyramid. So I'd say that we don't have a very broad base for our trophic pyramid to have a lot of other organisms, and a lot of times these other organisms have a lot of aesthetic value to us. Things like fungi and insects. There's a lot of insects that have a high aesthetic value. This, I guess, is a Cecropia moth. And again, pesticides and a very limited environment aren't conducive to diverse forms of life. A very white moth. A little bit difficult to explain in terms of natural selection, how that critter stays alive. But and also in terms of pollination and so forth. A lot of times well, bees are the obvious case where sometimes they truck bees in, and if you don't have enough pollinators, you can't have a poor set of fruit or vegetables. Also, a little higher in terms of aesthetics, it's my best picture of a woodpecker. Not a very good picture, but a lot of birds. Now I think I'm getting into the neighborhood of organisms that you can relate to that might be missing in the traditional landscape. A lot of these things depend, particularly take woodpeckers, depend on bark with different textures. Some of these woodpeckers can be very specific. This guy maybe only does trunks. There's another guy that only does the big branches in the top and so forth. Some only work out in the tips. And if you only have one species, thornless honey locust or something, this guy is probably not going to have these little organisms, whatever they come for in there. They aren't going to be there. So by restricting the diversity of our landscape, we're restricting some of the freebies, woodpeckers and things like that have a lot of aesthetic interest. One good example of this is interstate highway system takes up a tremendous amount of land. You can see in this case, it's really providing the only year-round vegetated cover in this area. So in a sense, that's a good feature. But usually, or it used to be that they were always mowed. In Iowa, they tried mowing late rather than mowing when they typically did. They mowed later in the year. And one study they found that they would have one pheasant nest per 2.5 acres because of the late mowing, whereas they would have been destroyed otherwise. In North Dakota, on I-95, they surveyed 23 miles of highway for 3 years and found 433 duck nests in an unmowed roadside. So it's another case where if you mow that off and limit the structure of that vegetation, you would be reducing something that we all, I think, agree have aesthetic benefits. Again, closer to home, squirrels. The landscape architecture people are all sort of living over in the quad, and you see the squirrels every day. I think they have a tremendous amount of aesthetic appeal. A lot of times you see people feeding them and so forth. Those squirrels, I think I could probably accurately state that those squirrels are dependent upon the fact that there are oak trees in the quad. They also eat hickories and so forth, and here you can see he's eating maple seeds. So the squirrels probably could get by in a maple forest, but the trees in the quad, the oaks are getting old and they're starting to die off, and typically we replace them with some other species. A lot of times exotic species, and so the long-term effect of that then is that someday there probably won't be squirrels in the quad because there won't be oak trees or hickory trees. So it's sort of another aspect of it, the fact that some animals are very dependent upon certain plant species, and again, they have this aesthetic benefit at no extra cost. Okay, then my second big category is aesthetic and educational reasons why to have natural landscapes, and I think that preservation of local character is important. Here you see rainforest in the Northwest. This is anybody that's been there can tell exactly where that was taken. It was in the Sierras. It's the sequoia trees. We drive across the country to see examples of local vegetation. Again, that tells you exactly, or at least it tells me, I think it's a fairly limited plant community, saguaro cactuses around Tucson. And I think that's desirable. Particularly architecture people should be able to relate to this idea, being concerned with preserving historic architecture, regional examples of architecture. This is sort of the same thing. I'm saying preserve, besides architecture, some of the natural character of regional landscapes. Most people probably couldn't relate exactly to that, but that is, I could probably tell you, at least within a band of a few hundred miles, or maybe more than that. This is a bur oak, which is a very prairie forest border plant. This one was taken in Wisconsin. They do occur in Indiana also. But again, this is, if you think, okay, you can show pictures of sequoias and things like that. We don't have any plants that says Indiana. Well, this is a plant that very much says Wisconsin, Minnesota, that area. In Indiana here we have sycamores and tulip trees and lots of plants that are very much, a strong statement of this area, and I think that they should be preserved. Another aesthetic benefit, I think, to natural landscapes is the fact that there are a lot of life forms that are not typically used in the traditional landscape that are very much a part of the natural landscape. In this case, ostrich ferns. Ferns have been used in the past to a certain degree, but not, I think, nearly as much as they should in the traditional landscape. They're a plant that grows in the dark. They grow in wet situations, which in the traditional application of landscaping is often a real problem to find anything that will grow, and that's where they're at home. So that's one life form. Another life form that isn't used, I think, that could be is mosses. Again, they take a very severe situation in terms of light and moisture. And it's a close-up of mosses. I think they have a nice sort of detailed aesthetic value. And mushrooms. I'm going to run through about 5 or 6 mushroom shots here because I get a real kick out of mushrooms. This isn't something that you can specify in your landscape plan that I want so many such and so mushrooms. It's pretty difficult to do. You probably could try by getting the spores or something and hope for the best, but it's the kind of thing that will occur and will surprise you. Again, for no effort, you get these little bonuses, and they depend upon dead wood, essentially. Decaying plant matter in the traditional landscape, that is almost by definition removed as being undesirable. So, all of these different sorts of things that I think are a real treat when you're walking along and all of a sudden you come upon something like that, just will occur naturally in the natural landscape if you provide the substrate, decaying wood, for it to happen in. Some just endless endless variety of forms and colors and so forth. Another kind of plant that isn't used as much as could be is grasses. And I don't mean, obviously grasses are used a lot, but one kind of grass, basically bluegrass, and it's cut. I think that there's a lot more that grass as a genus or generically has to offer. Here you can see the seed heads being lit by the sun, has stem color and so forth, adds winter interest. Bluegrass, in the winter has nothing to offer. Silhouettes, when's the last time you saw bluegrass silhouetted against the sunset? I don't think I've ever seen it. So I think that's another sort of a life form that could be used a lot more. One thing that I sort of alluded to also is the fact that native plants are adapted to a diversity of habitats. In this case, the water lilies, a very, very wet habitat. There probably are exotic plants that would take this. You could get them from somewhere, but this is a native plant that will take a very wet habitat. Past flowers sitting on a very dry habitat, just the opposite, and there's something in between, every extreme in between. Very dark habitats, geranium growing in the woods, or again, a very light habitat, not past flower, prairie smoke, growing out on a very dry prairie. So that's another thing, the fact that they will accommodate all sorts of habitats. Okay, seasonal interest is another benefit. I think the traditional landscape really doesn't have a great seasonal interest. You may have something like a crabapple that may have flowers and fruits or something, but tends to be fairly limited. In a prairie, you have a diversity of species, and each one blooms at a different time, and so there's a sequence of interest all through the year. This is shooting star, which is a spring plant on the prairie. Here's black-eyed Susan, sort of an early summer plant. Later in the summer, purple coneflower. And kind of late in the summer, prairie dock. And in the fall, gentians and asters are also very common plants in the fall. So, and that's just 5 or 6 plants. There's hundreds that occur if you introduce them, and sometimes they introduce themselves. Then also beyond the flowering sequence, there's the winter character. Again, I think the traditional landscape really breaks down in the wintertime. This is a prairie. You can see with an ice storm, it really does wonders. It coating all the stems and so forth, where a bluegrass lawn would be flat and would just become a hazard to walk on. This becomes sort of a whole new world. Adds considerable interest. Then there are some other aesthetic considerations. For example, just go through these fairly quickly. This will be a little bit more slides and less talk. But for example, pattern is an important part of oh, this is still winter character. Forgot one slide here. Showing how, rather than just a flat white surface, there's all these different textures and shadows and so forth. Okay, pattern. Very often, pattern becomes a very important part of the natural landscape. Here you can see the different, slight topography changes and the different textures of the seed heads on these plants, how they reflect the sun differently. Again, the traditional landscape doesn't usually accommodate that. Here is a pattern created by a rush in a sandy environment in the dunes. And here's the same sort of a thing happening in the snow in a very different, in a wet situation. So that's a couple of examples of pattern. Color, numerous different ways that plants can provide color. And there you saw flower color. Here's bittersweet fruit color. And I guess you could say dead wood color, too. Throw that in for good measure. Leaf color. That's, you know, you get leaf color with exotic plants, too. I'm just sort of going through the book here. And bark texture. Again, that's a consideration that goes into traditional reasoning, but a lot of times we rely on one or two species, and I think there's a lot of more that can be done. Also related texture that sort of showed bark texture. Here we see an example of leaf texture, or actually this isn't leaf texture, seed head texture, I guess. But again, the kind of a thing that you don't see. I might add that this isn't a native plant, just showing that you can have this sort of an effect for the natural environment without having all native plants. This is really a weed, Orchid foxtail barley, but left to its own devices, it can be very aesthetically pleasing. And leaf litter, also lots of different textures depending on the species that occur there. You can see conifers and red maple and elm, sugar maple. And bark texture. Here you see lots of different barks giving a textural quality to this landscape. And sculptural form, another thing that really isn't, I don't think, considered in the traditional landscape. Here, again, dead wood giving an added bonus. Besides the organisms that it might provide substrate for, I think kind of an interesting sculptural form. Another one, again, coated by the great ice storm of '76. But very interesting sculptural form, I think. And sometimes they get to be almost cutesy, I guess. But I think even at this scale, you might not call that a sculptural form, but I think that's very attractive. And again, if leaves were removed, you wouldn't have something like that happening. Sort of another general category is kinetic art and sound, that different parts of the plant, petioles and groaning branches and blowing leaves and so forth, can provide sounds and sights that are very aesthetically pleasing. Also smells, Golden Alexander. There's different parts of plants that also provide smell, flowers and fruits and leaves and so forth. And again, I guess I keep coming to this fairly often, but the idea of wildlife as an aesthetic benefit of natural landscapes. Very often it's small things like insects that are provided because of flowers, but sometimes the different textures of habitat are very important in terms of browse and cover. You probably won't find too many deer in the oops, I'm only going back. No, in traditional landscape, and particularly again birds are very
very closely related to the amount of opportunities that you provide in the landscape in terms of texture. Okay, so then the bottom line of all of this that I've said, I think, is that the traditional landscape precludes many of these experiences that I think are very attractive, and it excludes them because it attempts to conform to what I would consider an outdated aesthetic norm, this sort of the old English concept of the picturesque, that it's something just to be viewed from a certain location. And I think the point then for landscape architects and architects is that if you can preserve native vegetation, you should do it. Here's an example of native vegetation that is not being preserved. I think this is a terrible trade-off. It's a state scientific area in Wisconsin. Somebody dumped garbage there. And the plover, which you saw, or upland sandpiper, you saw in the previous slide, seems to be surveying its habitat. And if I could read bird faces, I would expect he probably has a sad bird face. How can you then preserve native vegetation? Well, I think there's sort of two levels that you could operate at. First, a macro scale. I think that it's worthwhile to preserve all of the best examples of natural vegetation for scientific and aesthetic reasons. There are a lot of environmental groups that we as environmentalists could belong to. There's one in particular that I think is very good, is the Nature Conservancy, and I'll give a little advertisement here, I guess. You can belong to something like Sierra Club, and it's a very good organization, does a lot of good things and so forth. It may stop a dam in California or a power plant, or not necessarily stop it, at least channel a little more thinking into environmental terms. But there's probably not too much that the Sierra Club will do for you in Delaware County, Indiana, or from wherever you're from. And the Nature Conservancy is an organization that will do that. If your grandmother's 80-acre farm has a nice woods in a spring or something, you could talk to the Conservancy, and they could make some sort of arrangements whereby your grandmother could either sell it or give it or whatever. There's any number of ways that can work to preserve landscapes right in your own backyard through the Nature Conservancy. So I think it's a very good organization to belong to if you really want to, see some sort of results right in your own backyard. Okay, now at a smaller scale, there's other things that we can do. Again, as architects and landscape architects, if you have natural vegetation on the site, I think it's best if you can avoid impact totally, if possible. If you can't avoid impact, I think it sort of is incumbent upon you to learn as much as you can about native plant communities so that you know what effect your impact might have. Some plant communities are fairly resilient and can take a certain amount of impact. Lowland forests are adapted to having silt deposited on top of them every spring. So if you wanted to put a parking lot, I think these are probably Asian box elder. They're fairly resilient to impact. You could probably do something, if you could even put a parking lot in there, you probably wouldn't expect to hurt the plants too much. If that were a sugar maple forest, though, probably you'd have a very good chance that you'd kill off the whole stand by doing something. So whatever you can do to minimize the impact and to know something about the community that you're having impact on. Here's an example of an oak forest. They've done a pretty good job. They kept the cats and everything out of this forest while they were doing construction. And I'm sure that they're going to have some adverse impact, but they're probably going to get away with having a fairly natural landscape because they did consider what they were dealing with fairly well. So I think you should preserve native vegetation for aesthetic reasons, not just because it sounds good, but I think it has aesthetic benefits which will reflect well on your project. Beyond that, I think it's also desirable to enhance native vegetation with development that restores and enriches the surroundings. Here you can see a university in Wisconsin where they have used prairie as a very economical and aesthetically pleasing. It's not a real well-done prairie in the sense that it's got a lot of the things that I've shown slides of, a lot of flowers and so forth. It's basically just one prairie grass, but it is, I think, a step in the right direction rather than mowing this whole site as would be traditionally done. So in conclusion, I would say that I think that people are becoming too removed from the natural systems and their natural heritage. A lot of times we see something like this. This is right on campus, one little tree, and this is in the summer when it had its leaves on. In the winter, it looks even less effective. I think that a whole mass of vegetation there might have been something that would be very attractive sort of thing. But people are becoming removed from the natural systems and their natural heritage. And I think that people should be allowed to experience nature much more intimately, right in their. You shouldn't have to go to Colorado or to Brown County, as is, I suppose, more feasible here, to experience nature. I think you should be able to do it right off of your own back porch. Okay, I'd like to thank Marvin for this opportunity, and I'd like to thank the audience for its attention. And if there's any questions that you might have afterwards, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.
Something like this, I mean, all the industries say, well, this is really, this aesthetic is big for us. But how do you go out and into a community that has got laws against things like that because it's considered nice? So I know many people that try and do something like that, and the community will get in on and say, well, if you don't clean that up, you plant grass until the law's done. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a real problem, and that has been dealt with in Wisconsin, where I'm from. I think the best thing that you can do as a designer is to try to create a landscape that is something of a compliment that won't be objectionable, that nobody will find it objectionable. I think that you can use a lot of times you might be dealing with a situation where maybe somebody has a row of arborvitae or something so the neighbor can't see it anyway. Maybe with a little fencing so they can't see it